Hi and welcome back to Offbeat Gyan. This is a video that provides a detailed summary of Act 5 of The Way of the World. The Way of the World is a Restoration era drama by William Congreve. Act 5 begins with Lady Wishford shouting at her maid Foible for betraying her. She calls Foible a bosom traitress. She says that she had helped Foible by preventing her from living on the streets, and she had given her a home, but Foible had betrayed her trust, and she asks Foible to go back to the streets. Foible is very worried. She confesses that she had indeed helped Mirabell in cheating and fooling Lady Wishford. Lady Wishford threatens Foible that she will have her arrested. Foible is very worried, and then Lady Wishford's daughter, Mrs. Fainall, walks into the room. And Mrs. Fainall informs Foible that Mirabell has already gone to secure the release of Waitwell, who had been arrested for impersonating. If you remember, in the earlier video, I had explained that Waitwell was actually Mirabell's servant, and in order to help Mirabell, he had taken on the role of Sir Rowland, and he had succeeded in fooling Lady Wishford. But in the meantime, Lady Wishford comes to know of the secret, the plan against her, and Waitwell is arrested. Mirabell has helped in securing the release of Waitwell. Foible then informs Mrs. Fainall that Mrs. Marwood and Fainall are responsible for all the problems. She tells her that Mrs. Marwood had overheard the entire conversation between them while sitting in the closet, and it was Fainall who had got Waitwell arrested, and it was Mrs. Marwood who had informed everything to Lady Wishford. Mrs. Fainall realizes that her mother also knows about her own affair with Mirabell. Arabella Wishford, or Mrs. Fainall, had always been in love with Mirabell, but at the same time she is good-hearted enough to help Millamant have her way with her fiancé Mirabell. Mrs. Fainall tells Foible that she is very relieved that she won't have to continue living with her scheming and cheating husband, Mr. Fainall. Foible also informs her about Fainall's affair with Mrs. Marwood. Mrs. Fainall is excited rather than unhappy, and she asks Foible for proof. Foible tells her that she and Mincing had been sworn to secrecy by Mrs. Marwood regarding the affair. Soon, Mincing arrives in the dressing room, and Mincing informs them that Waitwell had been released from prison. Lady Wishford is very upset, and she is worried by the threats of Fainall. Fainall had threatened Lady Wishford that Millamant's refusal to marry the man of her aunt's choice meant that she must give up her £6,000 inheritance. And Fainall blackmails Lady Wishford. He demands control over Millamant's inheritance, otherwise he will reveal everything about his wife, Mrs. Fainall. He also demands his wife's share of the fortune. So Lady Wishford is very tense. What he says is that he will tarnish his wife's reputation, he will wash the dirty linen in public, he will inform everybody about Mrs. Fainall's affair with Mirabell if his demands are not accepted by Lady Wishford. He also wants to have complete control over Lady Wishford's money, and he wants her to promise that she will not marry so that he will be the sole heir of the entire property. So, during this scene, Mrs. Marwood is consistently persuading Lady Wishford to accept Fainall's demands. She keeps on pestering Lady Wishford to listen to Fainall and hand over the control of her property, her daughter's property, and her niece's property to Fainall. But then what happens is the facts about his affair with Mrs. Marwood are revealed by the two maids. But he is undeterred. He is not at all affected by all this. He says that he will still go public. He will go ahead with his threats. Meanwhile, Millamant says that she is ready to marry Sir Wilful. thus listening to her aunt and saving her £6,000. When Millamant says this, Fainall suspects a trick and he continues to press for control over his wife and mother-in-law's fortune. At this point of time, Mirabel, who is there, reveals that Mrs. Fainall had already signed over her entire fortune to Mirabel before marrying Fainall because they had suspected that Fainall would eventually blackmail them. So, angry and vexed, Fainall and Mrs. Marwood leave the stage. Lady Wishfort finally discovers that Fainall was a villain and Mrs. Marwood was not a true friend. She was an enemy. She forgives Mirabel and gives her consent to the marriage between Millamant and Mirabel. Thus, the play ends on a happy note after a lot of twists and turns.